Jake sat at the dinner table, swirling the last sip of whiskey in his glass, watching the way Ashley moved. She had always been smooth, always quick with an answer, but tonight something about her felt off. It was the little things. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear a fraction too often, the way she glanced at her phone but never picked it up, the way she barely touched her food. And then there was the sigh, that damn dramatic sigh. "Jake, you're overthinking," Ashley said, setting down her fork with a clink that felt louder than it should have. "There's nothing going on. Why do you always have to look for problems where there aren't any?" Jake didn't react. He didn't challenge her. He didn't even blink. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone and tapped the screen a few times. Then, without a word, he slid it across the table toward her. Ashley's face didn't change immediately, but Jake noticed the way her hand hesitated before she reached for it. That tiny moment of hesitation, barely a second long, was all the confirmation he needed. She glanced down, her fingers trembled. Jake leaned back, his expression unreadable, watching as the blood drained from her face. Her mouth parted slightly as if she were about to say something, but then she shut it again. For the first time in their marriage, Ashley was speechless. The messages were right there in front of her. Dozens of them. Late-night exchanges, playful teasing, conversations dripping with intimacy. She had tried to cover her tracks, deleting messages and hiding notifications, but Jake had been ahead of her. He had anticipated every lie, every manipulation, every desperate attempt to gaslight him into believing he was imagining things. "Jake," she finally said, forcing out a weak chuckle, though her voice wavered. This isn't what it looks like. I can explain." Jake tilted his head slightly, almost amused. "Then explain." Ashley's lips pressed together. She was scrambling, trying to find an angle, a loophole, anything to claw her way out of the trap she had walked into. But there was none. Jake had given her every chance to tell the truth. Now, he was done waiting. Ashley's hand hovered over Jake's phone, her fingers tightening into a half-clenched fist before she finally picked it up. Her nails tapped against the screen as she scrolled, her eyes darting across the messages, absorbing the undeniable proof. Jake had been methodical. The messages weren't just fragments of conversations. They were an entire timeline of deception. Screenshots, timestamps, and even the occasional voice note. The story of her affair was written in cold, digital ink. For the longest time, Ashley had been certain she was in control. She had dismissed Jake's questions, played off his suspicions with a laugh, and twisted his concerns into something ridiculous. "You're paranoid. You need to trust me. Why do you always assume the worst?" But now, the worst was right in front of her, and there was no twisting her way out of it. Jake studied her reaction with a quiet intensity, his face unreadable. He had never been the type to lash out in anger. That wasn't his way. He preferred patience, observation, strategy, and that's exactly what had brought them here. While Ashley had spent months believing she was outmaneuvering him, Jake had been collecting everything. He had noticed the changes, the late nights that didn't add up, the whispered phone calls in the bathroom, the sudden password-protected apps on her phone. He had paid attention to the way she would casually mention Tyler, the supposed colleague from work, in passing, only to later deny she had ever talked about him. He had memorized every inconsistency, every lie she told, so effortlessly. The night his suspicions became certainty, he didn't confront her. He didn't demand answers. Instead, he waited. While Ashley was sleeping soundly beside him, convinced she had fooled him yet again, Jake had quietly retrieved her phone. She thought she was clever, but she had underestimated him. She had deleted the messages from her chat with Tyler, but she had forgotten about cloud backups. A simple sync to her laptop, one she had never imagined he would think to check, had given him access to months of conversations she thought were erased forever. It had taken him less than an hour to uncover everything, but still, he didn't react. He simply watched. He watched as Ashley kissed him goodbye in the mornings while texting Tyler, "Leaving now, can't wait to see you." He watched as she came home late, claiming she was exhausted from work when she had spent the evening at a hotel. He watched as she reassured him, with wide eyes and a soothing voice, that he was imagining things, while Tyler was sending her heart emojis just minutes before. The betrayal wasn't just in her actions, it was in the confidence with which she lied to him. That was what burned the most. So he had done what any rational man would do. He had built his case, piece by piece, not just for himself, but for this moment. The moment where she realized She had never been in control, not really. Ashley exhaled sharply, finally tearing her gaze away from the phone, her expression shifting from shock to something almost pleading. "Jake, listen to me," she started, her voice suddenly gentle, calculated. This isn't what it looks like." Jake said nothing, he just stared. Ashley set the phone down and reached for his hand, her fingers barely brushing against his before he pulled away. That single motion. Small, effortless, cut deeper than any slap or scream ever could. Ashley's breath hitched, her confidence flickering. For the first time, she looked uncertain. "You've been distant lately," she tried again, scrambling for a foothold. "Maybe if we just talked." Jake let out a small, humorless chuckle, shaking his head. She was still trying to turn this around, still trying to manipulate the narrative, still pretending that if she just said the right combination of words, she could undo the damage. Ashley had spent months gaslighting him, making him doubt himself, making him question his own reality. But now, there was nothing left to question. He had the truth, and the truth didn't need her permission to exist. Without a word, Jake stood up, his chair scraping softly against the hardwood floor. He reached for his phone and slipped it back into his pocket. He didn't yell. He didn't accuse. He simply walked toward the doorway, leaving Ashley sitting there, breathless and shaken. "Jake," she called after him, her voice tight with panic. "Please, let's talk about this." He paused for just a moment, looking at her over his shoulder. His voice was calm, steady, final. "We just did." And then he left her sitting there, alone, with the mess she had made. Ashley sat frozen at the dinner table long after Jake had left the room, her mind spinning, her breath uneven. She reached for the phone again, her fingers trembling as she scrolled through the damning messages, as if hoping, praying that somehow she had misread them, that it wasn't as bad as it seemed. But the evidence was undeniable. Every conversation, every sneaked-in "I miss you," every intimate joke exchanged with Tyler, it was all there. Her stomach twisted violently. She had never thought this would happen. Not like this. Ashley had always been the one in control. She had perfected the art of dodging suspicions, of twisting the truth just enough to make Jake doubt himself. When he had asked innocent questions, she had laughed and rolled her eyes. When he had gotten too close to the truth, she had feigned defense, even tears, and it had always worked. Until now. Now everything had changed. The fact that Jake had all this information and had chosen not to say a word until now, that scared her more than if he had yelled, accused, or broken things. He had been watching, studying her, waiting. That realization sent a chill down her spine. Her first instinct was to go after him, to explain, to fix this before it spiraled completely beyond her control. But how? What could she possibly say that wouldn't sound like the weak, desperate excuse that it was? She pushed back her chair and hurried to the bedroom, expecting to find Jake standing there, maybe even willing to listen. But the room was empty. His closet door was slightly ajar, the dark space inside staring back at her like a warning. She walked over and pushed it open further, holding her breath. His clothes were still there, his shirt still neatly hung, his shoes still aligned on the floor. He hadn't packed. Not yet. A sliver of relief flickered in her chest. Maybe she still had time. Maybe she could undo this. She grabbed her phone and dialed his number. It rang once, twice, then straight to voicemail. He had silenced her. Her hands clenched around the device as she swallowed a rising wave of panic. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Jake was supposed to confront her with anger, demand an explanation, give her an opening to twist things back in her favor. He was supposed to break, not shut her out completely. For the first time in years, Ashley felt powerless. She sat down on the bed, gripping her forehead, trying to think. There had to be a way to regain control. Then an idea struck her. Tyler. She quickly opened her messages, her fingers flying over the screen. "Ashley, call me." Urgent. No response. She chewed her lip, debating, then sent another. "Ashley, I think Jake knows. We have a problem." Still nothing. Her stomach twisted even harder. She tapped on Tyler's name and called him directly. The phone rang for far too long before going to voicemail. A cold, sinking realization settled over her. Tyler wasn't going to pick up. Her mouth went dry. Of course he wouldn't. Why would he? Tyler had never been the kind of man to stand firm when things got difficult. He had been fun, exciting, a secret escape, but he had never been reliable. And now, when she needed him the most, he had already disappeared. Ashley felt sick. She had miscalculated everything. Jake had all the proof he needed. Tyler was already gone, and now she was completely alone. Her breathing quickened as she tried to think of what to do next. Maybe if she could talk to Jake before he made any big decisions. Maybe if she could find the right words, make him understand that it wasn't what he thought. But a deeper part of her, a part she had long ignored, knew this wasn't something Jake would forgive. Her husband had given her every opportunity to tell the truth, every chance to come clean. But she had dismissed him, mocked him for even suspecting. And now, he held all the power. The house, the finances, everything was in Jake's name. She had no backup plan, no safety net. Her affair had been a game to her, a thrill, a secret rebellion against a life that had started to feel predictable. She had never truly considered what would happen if she got caught, but Jake had. He had been thinking about it for weeks, maybe even months, planning, waiting for the perfect moment to dismantle her carefully curated reality. Ashley grabbed a sweater and rushed toward the front door, yanking it open as if she expected to find him standing outside, waiting. But the driveway was empty. Jake was gone, and with him, so was any chance of fixing this. She swallowed hard, her throat burning as she stared into the night. For the first time, she understood exactly what was happening. She wasn't just losing the argument, she was losing Jake, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Ashley stood at the doorway, her breath coming in uneven bursts, staring at the empty driveway as if she could will Jake's car to reappear. But he was gone, and the longer she stood there, the more it sank in. This wasn't just another argument where she could talk her way out of it. This wasn't something she could fix with a well-timed apology or a few tears. This was different. She turned back inside, locking the door out of habit, though the house felt eerily silent now. The walls seemed to close in on her, the familiar furniture suddenly foreign. Everything had shifted, like the foundation of her world had been quietly pulled out from under her, and now she was left scrambling for balance. She needed to think. Jake hadn't packed, which meant he wasn't leaving for good. That was something, but what was he doing? Where had he gone? And more importantly, what was he planning? Ashley's mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. Was he talking to a lawyer? Gathering more evidence? Telling their friends, their family? Did he even need to? The proof was all there. He had played the long game, waiting until she had no way out, and now the next move was his. A sharp wave of nausea rolled through her. She needed to talk to him before he made any final decisions. If she could just get him to listen, maybe, just maybe, she could salvage something from this disaster. She grabbed her phone and called him again. Voicemail. Again, straight to voicemail. She cursed under her breath, pacing the living room. He wasn't just ignoring her, he was shutting her out. Jake had never been the type to storm off in blind anger. That wasn't his style. When he acted, it was calculated, which meant whatever he was doing right now, he had already thought it through. Ashley's pulse pounded in her ears. She needed to find him, force a conversation. She grabbed her car keys and rushed outside, her hands shaking as she slid into the driver's seat. The thought of Jake controlling how this ended, of him being the one to dictate the fallout, made her skin crawl. She refused to be powerless. She drove without a clear destination, hoping to spot his car, hoping she could catch him before he did something irreversible. First, she checked the bars he sometimes visited, the quiet ones, where he liked to sit in the corner with a drink and think. Nothing. Then, she checked the park where he sometimes went on long walks to clear his head. Still nothing. Where the hell was he? Frustration burned in her chest, but beneath it, a deeper, colder fear took root. What if he had already gone to see Tyler? The thought nearly made her swerve off the road. If Jake had confronted him, if he had thrown the evidence in Tyler's face, then this was worse than she thought. Jake wouldn't get into a physical fight. He wasn't that kind of man. But he was smart, dangerous in his own way. If he wanted to destroy Tyler, he wouldn't use his fists. He would use facts. Ashley quickly pulled into an empty parking lot and fumbled with her phone, dialing Tyler's number. Straight to voicemail. Her stomach twisted painfully. What if Tyler had already cut her off? What if he had done what men like him always did? Run. Ashley tried again. No answer. She gripped the steering wheel so hard her knuckles turned white. This couldn't be happening. She had been so sure she was in control, so certain that she was the one making the rules. But now it was clear Jake had been the one watching, waiting, planning. She thought back to the way he had looked at her earlier, the way he had simply slid the phone across the table and let her world collapse in silence. He hadn't yelled. He hadn't even accused her. He had let the truth do the damage. And it had. Ashley slammed her foot against the gas pedal, heading home with a single thought pounding in her mind. She had to get ahead of this, somehow. By the time she pulled into the driveway, the house was still dark, still empty. Jake hadn't come back. But someone else had been there. Her breath caught as she stepped onto the porch and noticed the envelope taped to the front door. Her name was written in Jake's neat, controlled handwriting. With shaking fingers, she pulled it down and ripped it open. Inside was a single printed sheet. A lift? Her stomach dropped as she read through it. Text messages retrieved from cloud backup. Voicemails recorded. Hotel receipts. Credit card statements attached. Security footage. Date/time stamped. It was everything. Every piece of proof he had against her, every mistake she had made, every lie she had told. At the bottom of the page, one final line sent ice through her veins. I don't need to destroy you. You've already done it yourself. Her breath came in sharp, panicked gasps. Jake wasn't just leaving her. He was making sure she understood, without a doubt, that she had already lost everything. She stumbled backward, gripping the edge of the porch railing to keep from collapsing. This wasn't just an ending. This was a reckoning. The door clicked softly behind Ashley as she stepped into the house. The quiet of the evening wrapped around her like a heavy blanket, pressing down on her chest. She hadn't been able to reach Jake again, and the thought of the list still clenched tightly in her hand filled her with a sickening dread. It was over. She knew it. Deep down, she had known it for days, but now it was clear. Jake was done. He wasn't coming back. Not in the way she wanted. Her gaze flicked to the living room. Everything looked so normal, so unchanged, yet it all felt like a cruel mockery of the life she had built. The same furniture, the same photos on the walls, and yet, in that moment, it was as if the space itself had become a hollow shell, empty and cold. The warmth, the comfort, the intimacy, they were all gone. Ashley let the list slip from her fingers and fall to the floor, but she didn't immediately kneel to pick it up. Instead, she stood there for a long time, staring at the sheet of paper like it was a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. She could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the soft tick of the clock on the wall, nothing out of place, except for the fact that Jake had already moved on. She didn't know where he had gone or what he was planning next, but she knew he was no longer hers. She sank down on the couch, her hands trembling. Her mind was a whirl of confusion, anger, and frustration. Why hadn't she seen it coming? Why had she let her guard down? She had been so sure, so convinced of her own ability to manipulate, to control the situation. But now, everything had slipped through her fingers like sand. She had been playing with fire, and now the flames had consumed her. The silence in the house seemed to grow louder. It was oppressive, suffocating. The reality of what she had done, of what she had lost, started to sink in with a crushing weight. Jake had trusted her, loved her, and she had betrayed him. There was no excuse for what she had done. The affair, the lies, the gaslighting, she had done it all, thinking she could get away with it, and now there was nothing left to say. She heard the front door creak open, and her heart skipped a beat. Jake. But when she turned, it wasn't him. Her breath caught in her throat as she saw who had entered. It was Tyler. For a moment they both just stood there, locked in a tense, awkward silence. Tyler's eyes shifted away from hers, uncomfortable, but then he stepped forward, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. Listen, Ashley, he held up a hand, cutting him off before he could finish his sentence. You don't have to explain anything, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her heart hammered in her chest, but she didn't have the energy to fight him, not anymore. I already know everything. Tyler's eyes softened, a look of regret flashing across his face. I'm sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen. I didn't think it would go this far. Ashley shook her head, her lips trembling with frustration. You don't get it, do you? It's not just about you or Jake. It's about me. I thought I had control over everything, but I was wrong. Tyler didn't answer. He just stood there, looking at her with a mixture of pity and guilt, and for a second Ashley wondered if he actually cared. But then she realized it didn't matter. It was too late for them. It was too late for everything. "I know you're angry," Tyler said, his voice low, "but you need to talk to Jake. It's not the kind of guy to hold a grudge. You can still fix this." Ashley's head snapped up at the words, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "Fix this? Fix this?" she repeated, her voice rising. "You think I can fix it? You think Jake is going to listen to me after everything that's happened?" Tyler stepped closer, his face earnest, but Ashley shook her head, backing away. "No, Tyler. I don't think you understand. I've lost him." There was a long silence between them, and in that moment Ashley realized something she hadn't fully understood until now. It wasn't just Jake she had lost, it was her own sense of control, her belief that she could bend reality to her will, her conviction that she could always talk her way out of things. That was gone now. Tyler shifted uncomfortably, glancing down at the floor. "I'll leave. But think about it, Ashley. If there's any chance left," she shook her head again. "There's no chance left." Tyler left without another word, and Ashley sank back onto the couch, her hands pressed to her face. She could feel the sting of tears behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had done this to herself. She had pushed everything too far, and now she was left with nothing. The hours passed in a blur of numbness. Eventually, the sound of Jake's footsteps echoed through the hall. He came into the living room and paused when he saw her sitting there, her face pale, her posture defeated. He didn't say a word at first. He didn't have to. The weight of his presence alone was enough to speak volumes. Ashley met his gaze, but there was no more fight left in her. Jake stepped closer, and without a word he reached down and picked up the list she had dropped earlier. He scanned it briefly before folding it neatly and slipping it into his pocket. He didn't look at her again. Without another glance he walked past her, out the door, and into the night. Ashley stared at the empty space where he had been, knowing deep down that this was the end. Not just of their marriage, but of everything she had believed in. She was alone now, and it was her fault.